Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Juanita Olguin. I lead product marketing here at Coveo. And today I'm really excited to be joined by Rowan Curran, senior analyst at Forrester. Rowan's research focuses on AI, data science, generative experiences, and he's also the author of the Forrester Wave for Cognitive Search. Rowan, I'm so excited to be talking very popular and maybe somewhat controversial topics today. We have 1 hour to explore these topics, so why don't we just jump right in?
Sounds great. Thank you so much for that wonderful intro, Juanita. And I'm super excited to be here with you and with everybody on the line today. It's a very exciting topic, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun as we go through and also answer some questions at the end. So what we're going to go through today is basically taking a look at how generative AI is impacting search and how search is impacting generative AI. And really, at the core of this, as we've all kind of seen over the past, I'd say, 14, 16 months or so, we've really seen generative AI come almost out of nowhere for a lot of us, less out of nowhere for others of us, and really just start to take over the cultural zeitgeist. And as we're seeing it today, generative AI has effects that really go way, way beyond business. They extend into our lives as individuals and into our lives as customers, and also to the way that we interact with businesses as employees, as well as constituents with our governments. And so there's tons of different use cases that are spread across, all of these different areas. But how we actually got to this moment wasn't just, through the introduction of a, new model into the world. It wasn't, the release of GPT 3.5 series of models that had been released by OpenAI in the fall of 2022. Those models were up on their website, available for nerds like us to play with, but it wasn't until this really great, application experience was released in late 2022 that everybody suddenly realized how powerful this stuff could be and how useful it could be in business and in our daily lives. And what this led to, once we kind of got this great application that everybody very quickly stuck onto, was this really wonderful complementary pressure from the top down and the bottom up in our businesses and in our enterprises, both from the executive and shareholder and board level, as well as from the individual contributor and consumer level, where everybody was excited about the potential of generative AI to transform our organizations and to really adjust the way that we seek, find, and retrieve information, and then also act upon it within all of our workflows. Now, what this did overall, aside from having this, broader appeal across, the enterprise, was really change the conversation around AI from being a very kind of high-level boardroom conversation where, it was very much about data science and building these very complicated models and perhaps implementing them for end users, to really bringing it down to a much more kitchen table conversation where, now the average person has some idea of how AI can actually affect them in their lives in both positive ways and ways that may be a little bit more nerve-wracking. But ultimately, what this means is that we have a huge amount of excitement and a huge amount of pressure to start building applications around this stuff. And the way that this has manifested over the past year, is a lot of folks in this call may be aware, is that we had tons of people just yelling out, "I need ChatGPT for my enterprise." In the same way that we had many of our customers yelling, "I need Google search for my enterprise," for the past 18 years or so. And in the same way that it's not as easy to build a public-facing high-quality search engine, it's not as easy to build a high-quality enterprise chat-based knowledge retrieval system as it is to build a very compelling consumer experience like ChatGPT. And one thing that this really drove was a huge explosion in the interest and the attention around search in 2022. And it actually led to search being the top use case that we saw within generative AI over the past year. And when I say search, I mean broadly any type of knowledge retrieval and or search type of business process that you are trying to go after and attack. Now, this is being used kind of across organizations for use cases like research and development. So one of the earliest use cases for large language models and search and knowledge retrieval was with that I was with a primary manufacturing company that was doing some materials design, and they wanted to use large language models to better understand the context of their previous research documents and research papers that they had published before. And then we also have lots of folks using search and knowledge retrieval applications supported by generative AI in all kinds of employee and internal facing customer support types of use cases. So these are things like having a more intelligent help desk support tool, like we've seen at a couple different telecom companies, both to help the internal enterprise end users kind of get basic help desk support, but then also to do more complicated things like help folks request environments for like virtualized compute environments for testing applications in, where those folks didn't necessarily have to know all of the details about that the technical environment they're requesting, because the language model was able to reference the necessary information and then generate the answer for the technical folks that were actually implementing it. But overall, we're seeing these knowledge retrieval use cases be kind of the key approach here. And we'll look at a bit more around the architectures later on in the presentation. But the most common approach that we're seeing to these knowledge retrieval use cases right now are some flavor of retrieval augmented generation, which you may have heard of. And as I said, we'll talk a bit more about later on. Now, I'm also going to talk about a few of the other very common use cases that we're seeing in the generative AI space before we move on. And I think it's really important to note these because particularly with the first two, they build off of and also complement the knowledge retrieval and search use cases. And then for the latter, it also can build off them as well, though in a little bit of a different direction. So the second very common use case that we're seeing for generative AI, and this is probably the most common use case when we exclude grounding in actual company data, is using large language models for writing and knowledge support. So this is everything from marketers and salespeople using large language models to help them write emails or generate new copy, to grant writers who are using large language models to help them, write the new request for whatever type of research grant they need to get. We have a lot of government folks who are looking at these types of use cases. But then we can also use this in support of our knowledge retrieval and search use cases as well. We've started to see folks actually integrate generative AI into their knowledge management and knowledge creation process, because these language models basically allow you to reformat and readjust and change content to fit whatever need you have. So, for example, a lot of folks, especially large manufacturing companies, are experiencing high turnover or very high employee aging or employee retirement rates. And so they're trying to capture all of that knowledge from all of those folks. And a lot of those folks aren't necessarily knowledge creators. And so they're looking at using generative AI as a way of having those folks kind of write down, a simple procedure for how to solve, a particular maintenance issue, and using a language model to then reformat it in a way that everybody else can consume. And kind of building off of that, we're also seeing tons of use cases for generative AI in content summarization and transformation. And now this one almost even more obviously fits directly into the knowledge retrieval and search use cases, as well as being as kind of own standalone use case. So, anybody who has been in the search space for the past couple of years has seen large language models be used for chunking documents, summarizing documents, things of that nature. But this has really started to, hit a new fever pitch of adoption, as well as a kind of broader set of applications for what types of content you are summarizing and why you are summarizing it. So probably, the quintessential example this year is using large language models for summarizing call center transcripts, which a whole host of different folks are doing at this point in time. But it's not just the value of summarizing those transcripts so you can have a good idea of, what happened on the call without having to read, line by line. It's that there's an additional step where we're seeing folks actually use generative AI large language models in the data pipelines to extract additional metadata, so things like topics, entities, sentiment, et cetera, from that summary, so that you can then drive a better search or a better text analytic experience down the road. So all three of these categories of use cases kind of bleed into and support each other, but ultimately these are kind of where the locus of generative AI use cases are today, with the very large exception of Turing bots for coding and testing. So I'm not going to talk too much about this here. I just wanted to make sure we are all aware of this significant space. So this is basically using large language models in support of software development for the generation of code and prototypes and things like that. And also to a lesser degree in support of analytics and data science. But this is another very important area of generative AI that we're seeing a significant amount of adoption and deployment. But ultimately, the focus of these things is really around the search and knowledge retrieval types of use cases and types of asks. And given that so many folks are really interested in search once again, and they're asking for it to be embedded in all of their applications, we've seen a plethora of companies just integrate some kind of adjunct search capability into their platform or into their application, or we've seen a lot of these what I will unkindly call ankle biter companies who have kind of come out and said, okay, well, we can do a question and answer with your PDF, so therefore we have a search experience for you. But when it comes down to it, what you really need for a true enterprise search experience, we're actually going to be searching across multiple different data sources and pulling back different types of information and dealing with all kinds of different things around security, access controls, and things like that. You're going to need a platform that can support all of these things. And a lot of the newer entrants into the search market can't necessarily do that because while you can skip a lot of the steps to get to a good search experience, by using large language models and a simple kind of vector retrieval today, there's lots of things that you can't just kind of build with the snap of a finger, like these security and access control to various data sources, like having the proper methods of filtering and pulling from various application and data source connectors, being able to do re-ranking of the results in a way that makes sense, or even doing chunking of the documents. This is an area that a lot of folks don't recognize as an important part of actually building generative AI applications, is taking a 500-page document and knowing what pages to break that up into in order to be able to reference it in a vector database. But ultimately, no matter what kind of search application or use case you are building, it's not just about the technology and it's not just about the data that underlies it. It really is about how you are using it. So before I get into a bit of a discussion around the architectures here, I just wanted to really emphasize that where folks are really falling off in their successful implementation of generative AI use cases overall, and then more specifically, some of these knowledge retrieval use cases, particularly ones that are chat-based, is in that change management step, in that implementation and fuller rollout step. So there's, I think, been a lot of excitement, and maybe we had a little bit of naivete around how sophisticated users would be when they started to interact with large language models, because it seems so easy for all of us to just go online and use ChatGPT. But when it comes to using it in an employment context, when it comes to using it in our work context, there's more training and shaping and nuancing of how you actually help people understand how to best use these tools and to make sure that they are sticky in terms of how people are actually accessing them. Now, in terms of what tools are available, there's a whole range of them that are out there, and they really span the entire stack of the hardware and software environments that we all deal with. Everything from embedded capabilities all the way down to model training and the various hardware capabilities that are associated with that. Now, again, I won't spend very much time here. Just wanted to call out that there's a very broad set of capabilities being offered by different vendors in the generative AI space. But to kind of help make sense of all of this stuff going on here, we've seen 4 main routes that folks are adopting generative AI into their organization. Now, they're not necessarily doing one or another of each of these approaches. They're actually doing a combination of several of these in many cases. So at the very first step, when folks get excited about generative AI, oftentimes they're just saying, okay, well, I'm going to go online and use whatever tool is available and not grounded in my enterprise data. And that's what we call bring your own AI, which is a very challenging issue for a lot of enterprises, and certainly something that if you are not thinking about it in your own enterprise, I would really start to consider what types of policies and approaches you have to folks that may be trying to get access to these tools if you're not providing them on your own. But then, we're seeing many more folks actually start to gain access to generative AI capabilities through embedded software. and through embedded capabilities within other applications. Now, this both means kind of embedded within endpoint applications, like single-use applications like text generators like Jasper or Writer. But then it also includes folks that are getting their generative AI capabilities embedded within their other software platforms. So embedded within their cognitive search platforms or embedded within their broader AI machine learning platforms. Folks, really are trying to access this, in a way that is within a familiar environment and that gives them additional tooling and support. Because if you go option 2 or option 3, as you see on here, you're going to have a significantly increased workload in terms of how you are shaping the inputs and the outputs of these models. And we'll take a look in the upcoming slides about what that actually means. Now, as I'm going through the next steps, I want to emphasize that, while I've been talking about generative AI throughout this entire presentation and also search, but mostly generative AI, that it's really important to keep in mind what you can do with predictive AI, particularly when we think about how we are combining it with generative AI. And what I mean by that is that we need to keep in mind all of the historical propensity modeling, segmentation, standard analytics, all of these types of things that have given us very good insights about our customers and about our companies, and remember to leverage them into our generative AI applications as well. Because one of the big aspects of generative AI applications is, while they are incredibly good at helping us derive deeper and more contextual information from unstructured data at this point in time, they are not necessarily good at doing analysis or extracting information from large-scale structured data. So we still have a great need for standard machine learning models and even statistical models to derive those insights that then maybe we are wrapping up inside of a nice natural language presentation with a large language model. So as I go through some of the architectures subsequently to this, keep in mind how you might be folding in the predictive AI into the generative AI applications. Now, before we get into the architectures, again, to just point out that the platform approach to this stuff, I think, is a very important thing to keep in mind for everybody. Because at this point in time, the amount of AI capabilities is really quite overwhelming. Even if we go beyond the applications and start getting into what are the technologies that are available, beyond the core AI platforms into these extended AI platforms that are emerging, like the low and no code platforms, so the AI ops tools, it can be very challenging for individual companies, individual enterprises to keep all of this stuff stitched together and to keep a good understanding of what is happening in the market. And so that's why, in part, we're seeing a very significant movement to platforms, both for AI applications more broadly, and then also for cognitive search solutions more specifically. So now I'm going to kind of quickly go through sort of the progression of what we're seeing in the knowledge retrieval space and how you can start thinking about the more advanced versions of knowledge retrieval applications today and tomorrow when we're thinking about incorporating large language models and generative AI into that. So at the base level, we have a very simple interaction. We have a user prompt that hits a model and generates a response. This is probably the generative AI experience that you are familiar with through the interaction with something like ChatGPT, where you enter a question and you get a response back. And it's not grounded in any external data. So here, I'm asking a kind of silly question about whether the mother in Jaws 4 is cyclically controlling the shark, and it's just kind of generating information from the trained knowledge that it has within the model itself. It's not actually grounding itself in any external information, and I, as a user, have no way to understand if any of that information is based in real fact or whether it's just a piece of coherent nonsense that's been kicked out by the model. Now, to start honing in the behavior of the model, we're going to start to add more components. So the first thing to add is a system prompt. And this is something that helps us ground the behavior of the model in the types of voice and the types of direction that we want it to go. So in this example, we're using a input shaping and a system prompt to basically ground this initial query. When do I need to file my taxes by? To shape it around some aspects that are important to this types of question, like not having it answer if it doesn't know, and only answering questions related to taxes. And so in this example, you would send that query to the model would generate an answer. And in this example, we're starting to take the first step of actually understanding the output and then making sure the output is high quality. So in this case, we would have the model or have the answer sent through another language model to review the answer, and then maybe have a human in the loop if this was a more batch application to check it and see if it was high quality or not, and then pass it off to the data set. So that's kind of the first step of how do we actually get these models to do what we need them to do. But that's not nearly enough for an enterprise user who really needs to be making the right decision with the right content. And so to do that, then we need to move into the realm of retrieval augmented generation. And this is what really starts to bring enterprise authenticity to generative AI. So in its most straightforward form, retrieval augmented generation is a way of not only using a language model, but using a language model in combination with your data stored in a vector database and then retrieved and then given to the language model and then summed up into an answer for you. So the way that it typically works is you have a question that is sent to a language model that then generates what's called an embedding, essentially a number that corresponds to that information. That is then sent to the data source, and a similarity measure is run, in this case, cosine similarity, pardon me. And then once the similar pieces of content have been pulled back from that data set, then they are sent to another language model which ingests that information and then takes that information, generates a new answer, and then is able to provide that answer to the end user, but it's able to provide that answer with citations from that information that it acquired. And so this is the type of application where you can finally start to ground it in real enterprise information, real enterprise knowledge, so you can start to do things with assurance and with great alacrity. And so one of the early examples that we saw of this was with the Mayo Clinic, who implemented a generative AI application where essentially they were using a set of vectorized disease information and some patient information with an application that was HIPAA compliant, which again, you can't just have kind of any software setup for this. They needed to have a HIPAA compliant setup in order to build their application, which is a pretty high bar for a lot of companies. And so they were able to set this up and then retrieve information about the diagnoses and the patient conditions in order to more quickly get to proper plan of care for a couple of different diseases, because they kind of tightly constrained the domains under which this retrieval is operating. But it essentially allowed them to get to information that they already had, but in a more contextual way that was then presented to them in a more consumable way because it was wrapped up in this natural language presentation from the large language model. Now, where it starts to get very interesting is when we start to go beyond this simple retrieval augmented generation architecture and start to integrate things like predictive AI into this combination of search and generative. So an example architecture of how these things are starting to be built out today are by doing things like taking the user prompt with the system prompt and then injecting into that system prompt additional data about the user. So information from your CRM system about their recent purchase history, information from your forecasting tool about whether they're likely to churn, and then inserting all of that information as part of the system query, basically like a kind of Mad Libs types of setup, so that whatever goes to the language model also has that additional grounding information even before we get to whatever retrieval we're going to do. And so then the large language model is able to create a much more sophisticated and contextual query, which can then go to the search database. And in this case, we're also not just talking about vector search. We're talking about a hybridized approach where you're combining lexical and keyword search, which have very good precision, and vector search, which has oftentimes very good recall and maybe slightly less good precision. And using the two of these, you can oftentimes get to a more nuanced answer than you might with either one of them separately. But once we have these, then we have the information, we have the set of results, but then we need to do all of that work to re-rank the results, to filter it out, to apply enterprise access control so we don't send the wrong information to the right end user. Once we do that, then we have the user prompt, the grounded contextualized enterprise data, and we can start to generate the final response to the end user. And so, as you can see, once we start to really get deep into how we are going to make applications that can be really robust and effective in being able to reference our enterprise data, the architectures start to get a little bit more complex. And this is still just our, generation one of enterprise generative AI applications, especially the knowledge retrieval ones. When we start to look at some of the folks that are really starting to move into the Gen 2 of these applications, they start to get a little bit more intense. So I won't spend a ton of time going through this slide and the next slide, but this is all just to point out that, essentially we're still starting with that same retrieval augmented generation core, that same core of I have a language model, I have some stuff I'm retrieving from, I need to pull back an answer, but we're adding in all this stuff on the left that we already talked about around adding the predictive insights and the machine learning insights to that initial query. But then we're also adding in things like a secondary model to build an execution plan. So if it's a more complex query that involves pulling information from multiple data sources or maybe doing some type of comparison, then you're going to need some type of model to build a plan for how to answer that question. And then as you get kind of deeper into this setup, then you also have to kind of review that plan. You have to then reference external agents if there's external information that you want to bring into whatever your response is. So it may not be enough for you to be searching your keyword and your vector indices. You may also need to call out to some external system like some type of manufacturing quality control system that is using, again, machine learning models or statistical analyses to produce insights that are then pulled back into your main system and then insert it into the query for the final model to then produce the final response for you. And then, when this gets really intense, then we also have folks that are implementing what is called LLM-as-a-judge, where essentially you are using large language models to judge multiple responses coming out of the application so that you are further refining the quality of the response. Because, large language models are somewhat non-deterministic. So having more than one option to present to the end user and choosing the better one can sometimes produce a better end user experience. We've already gone over the previous slide, so I won't overwhelm everyone even more by going over this approach. But the one thing that I do want to point out on this slide is that not only are we talking about how can we retrieve information and bring it back to the end user, we're also talking about how we can go out into external systems and take actions there. So one of the big steps in the kind of Gen 2 of enterprise generative AI applications is a lot of folks are now focused on how do we use these tools to also generate code from the language model that's then going to go run in some external system, execute some action, or retrieve some information, then bring it back to us in the main application. That's really where this is starting to go in the future. But before I say thank you and goodbye to everyone, I do want to point out two quick things here at the end. And the first is the rise of multimodal large language models. So this has been, an area that it's been very exciting, the research for the past number of years. But last year we saw kind of the first research models released around this with Cosmos 1 and a couple others from Microsoft. And then we saw GPT-4 and now Gemini from Google, which these models are now able to interact with both images as well as written content. And that opens up a whole new world of use cases for knowledge retrieval and search and for all types of enterprise knowledge management. So in this example here, I just grabbed a random process flow diagram off of Google image searches, looking at the Amazon Web Services flow. And I asked Gemini to describe what was going on and how I could implement this. And it did a pretty good job of doing that. And so you can see how this could, really start to bridge the gap between teams and between parts of the organization that may not have, a deep institutional or historical link between them, but they need to understand how their processes are working, how they might interact, how their data systems might interact. And this can really help start to bridge that gap. And, in the last few seconds before I go, I also want to point out that, there's been a lot of talk about image generation and a lot of talk about deepfakes and stuff like that. But when we're talking about an enterprise context, I think there's some interesting use cases out there that a lot of us haven't considered. And this is just one quick example of them. So this is using a model called QR control nets on top of Stable Diffusion, which essentially allows you to control the generation of an image and form it into a workable QR code. So, this is, I sorry, can't recall the prompt off the top of my head that we used to generate this, but if you take a photo of this QR code, it's a workable QR code in addition to being a photo of a library, and it will take you to Forrester.com. And so this type of image generation use case, again, this starts to really change how you are thinking about knowledge creation and knowledge management. Because if you can kind of integrate this type of knowledge interaction with your environment, that's a much more kind of ambient communication tool than having, you know, a big black and white QR code on an otherwise, you know, nice poster. But with that, I will say thank you to everybody for your time today. It's been really great chatting with you, and yeah, I'll pass it back over to Juanita.
Thank you, Rowan. Wow, so much great information. I have a ton of questions for you, and so does our audience and our guests here. I will ask these one by one if that's okay, and I'll try to add a bit more context where I see some of these are going.
Great.
The first question is around how complex building a GenAI system seems. So the question is, building a solution seems complex with so many parts and components. How can companies ensure they're building GenAI properly, and what are they missing to have an effective system?
Yeah, well, so the latter part is very hard to answer because there's a lot of components, and there's, you know, an ever-increasing number and an ever-increasing way of combining those different components. So that's the first thing that I will say on this. The second thing that I will say is that, you know, for most companies, unless you are a high-tech company or you are very, very focused on innovating around these tools, you definitely need a partner to work with you in terms of understanding, you know, what are the best practices to building whatever flavor of retrieval augmented generation you're going to do, or, you know, think about how you're going to source generative AI capabilities. If you're not going to build it yourself, you know, are you going to get it as part of, you know, a prepackaged solution, or are you going to kind of tweak some kind of co-pilot or something like that? So this partner aspect, I think, is really crucial for everybody who's adopting generative AI overall. And that could be, you know, a direct technology partner, it could be an implementation partner, just somebody who's able to spend more direct time understanding how the space is moving and how it's evolving, because it is evolving very fast. So if we have been having this conversation, you know, 6 or 7 months ago, the amount of nuance and complexity in terms of how much we knew about the extended retrieval augmented generation architectures and what, you know, were effective about them and what were kind of the best practices, they would have been much, you know, that would have been a much shorter section than we just had. So the space is moving and evolving very quickly. So having somebody who is able to kind of track those evolutions and changes, and you know, honestly, for a lot of us, it's not worth paying attention to, you know, Anthropic or whoever else kind of coming out with their newest model every other week. It's very cool, and a lot of them advance the space, you know, pretty significantly. But when we're building enterprise applications, when we're rolling them out to our end users, we can't be thinking about changing the underlying model every 2 or 3 months. Like, that's just not feasible, not sustainable. So that would be kind of the second part of this, is work with partners, but also, and then also don't get caught up in the new shiny around this. And the third piece that I will say is that having your data in order it's almost like banal to say at this point in time. I say this every time a new technology comes along. You have to have your data in order to be successful, but it's so critical here. And it can really cause you to either, you know, be able to accelerate very quickly in the space and start to build something very useful, or if you don't have your data, you know, accessible, well structured, all that type of stuff, it can take a lot longer to build a solution that is extremely powerful and useful and accurate for you. And that doubly goes for if the content that you're thinking about making part of your solution is very long in length. You know, we have much longer context windows than we did, you know, even a few months ago, but still this aspect of how do you chunk things down is very important.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Maybe along the same lines, the question here is around advancements in the GenAI space seem to be accelerating. So how can companies catch up? Can they catch up? And could GenAI be the tech that helps leapfrog the status quo, maybe leapfrog the competition? What are your thoughts there?
Well, so if you can implement AI overall well, not just generative AI, I definitely think that can be a huge differentiator for your company. But I will say that just leveraging generative AI into your company, that is the table stakes at this point in time. You know, really at this point, it's all about, you know, how can you like I was talking about before, how can you differentiate on your data and make this the most applicable to your organization so that you can find what is special and unique about, your information and then act upon it. And in terms of kind of keeping up with everything, again, I think it's important to not just get super hyper focused on what the newest and coolest model is. It's important to really, look at pragmatically what types of use cases do we want to build, what models are available today, and how do we start going out there and building whatever architectures around them we need to. Or in some cases, you don't need to even focus on the model itself, because there is plenty of variability in the quality of the models, but there's also a ton of variability in the quality of prompt engineering that folks are doing, the quality of input and output controls that people are working on. And all of that stuff really, really matters in terms of what kind of capability you're going to get out of the other side of the model. So, for example, I have seen plenty of fantastic generative AI applications that are using, BERT and StarCoder, or GPT-J or something like that. Some of these, lower end models, quote unquote, at this point in time. But they were performing admirably well in the circumstances they were deployed in. And could it have been done better if it was using GPT-4 or Claude 3? Possibly, maybe, but would that differential in terms of it's that much better actually be worth the additional cost and the additional switching cost? I think that is much more questionable. And that aspect of dialing in what model we're using, how we're using it, that is going to be a big theme throughout the course of this year. 2023 was a big year of just folks getting very excited about generative AI, kind of just starting to not even dip their toes in, just kind of jump in with both feet. And this is the year of optimization and learning how to swim. And so that's what the huge focus has been on. How do we actually get these models to retrieve the information that we want them to retrieve, be able to audit that information to make sure that it's valid, and then present it to our end users in a cheap and fast way. That's really what everybody's kind of honing in on right now.
Great. Thanks for that response. Moving on to this next question. You talked about this a little bit on one of your prior slides. The question is around, we know a lot of tech giants are investing heavily in the GenAI space to offer GenAI within their actual software solutions. But there's also concern about vendor lock-in and being tied into a tech monolith. So what are your thoughts for companies around how they should make these purchase decisions or tech buying decisions?
So I would say, most folks, I would recommend that you look to whoever your already trusted providers and partners are, and not necessarily try and go find whoever the coolest, newest startup is with the biggest model that you can find is. And within that, we do see, folks like all of the hyperscalers are offering various models. They all have various platforms for this. But one thing that we've noticed, not just in my research on the cognitive search space, but now we're doing research on the AI foundation models for language market, which is all of these providers. And one very interesting thing about this space is there's tons of cross-pollination. So aside from the fact that there's a limited talent pool, and so a lot of these folks have spread out from one or more companies to all these others, but there's lots of cross-investment between different players in this market. So you have, for example, Microsoft and Amazon both investing in Mistral, and you obviously have then Microsoft and Amazon both investing in their own respective pet companies as well. But there's a lot of cross investment going on between all the big players in this space, and I think that buyers here should go in a couple different directions. So if you're trying to just get kind of a capability that is built into some type of application that you're getting, you're not going to be developing the solution or kind of working on anything technical under the hood. You're kind of leaving that to your partners. Then I would say the model underneath doesn't necessarily matter as much to you, as long as you are not the one who's responsible for metering or gating its cost. And that's where we're seeing a lot of folks kind of go on this. Is there was a big push for I need to bring my own model in all circumstances, and I need that choice. And that is still there to a certain degree, but lots of folks are also saying, actually, this is too much for me for XYZ use cases here and whatever. I don't want to figure this out for myself. I want to figure out only for my differentiating applications. But on the other hand, for anybody who does want to kind of build things out, they are really trying to not lock themselves too deeply into any one provider. And to that end, we've seen tons of uptake of open source models overall, and of open source providers. And then additionally, we've seen, I would say nearly all of the proprietary providers also providing some way to access open source models as well. And then, I think moving forward, I think we're going to continue to see a huge proliferation of models, not just kind of the core foundation models, but also domain-specific models and other models that are more specifically tuned and quantized for particular purposes. And that, I think, is going to be driving a lot of the movement in this landscape. And I think that, that is, again, going to reduce the want to lock into any one particular vendor. But I do think that it's also important to recognize that, even if you are locked into, if you're not locked into a vendor, and you're trying to switch between models, there's still a switching cost that is significant for large language models that doesn't exist for necessarily like all other technologies. So if you're switching from, let's say, GPT-4 to Claude 3 again, if we're going to use those, or to GPT-J, or Mistral or Falcon T5 or whatever it is, or Falcon 180, or Flan T5, then the prompts that you're giving to these models are very different, and you're going to have to re-engineer them. So, it's neither of these kind of approaches is going to save you from all problems. It's just going to be, how are you thinking about what type of long-term strategy and what type of long-term approach that you want to take to this space.
Amazing. Lots of useful information there. Thank you. Earlier in the presentation, you talked about a few different use cases for GenAI, knowledge retrieval, and others. When it comes to business applications, which are the most prime or popular to be enhanced by GenAI? Any specific ones you're seeing there?
Ones that have not been enhanced by generative AI at this point?
Or most prime to be enhanced by GenAI in terms of whether it's customer service side, maybe sales, other.
So I think there's a lot of distance to go in improving the marketing and sales pipelines and their communication with broader organizations using generative AI. So we've just started to see kind of the broader lifecycle components get enhanced by generative AI and integrated in. So for example, like customer feedback and customer research tools are just starting to fold in generative AI capabilities. We had already had kind of the text generators and whatnot folded into to these workflows as well. But I think that's one space where the whole life cycle, once kind of more components kind of come into this, the whole marketing, sales, and customer experience life cycle can really be enhanced by these tools. But I think it's important to also recognize that at this point, that's mostly going to be kind of on the back end. It's not necessarily going to be customers are all going to be interacting with large language models from your favorite brand. We will probably see more of that over the course of this next year. And, a few of them have been rolled out already, but there's so much to be done internally, and there's a lot more ways to manage risk around internally deployed generative AI applications. That's what I expect to see, in the short and midterm around this. And then I think, the other prime area, I think, to be, almost completely reinvented to a certain degree is knowledge management overall. And just the practice of how we create, manage, and maintain knowledge within an enterprise. So one of my colleagues, Julie Moore, who is fantastically smart, has this great concept that she's been pushing for a couple of years around agile knowledge management, essentially bringing the ideas of agile development to how we create and manage knowledge. And that was a great concept, a great idea, but as with agile software development, that requires a lot of effort, communication, and a lot of overhead to make that possible. With large language models, like I was talking about before, with the manufacturing folks who can have these folks who are about to retire easily generate knowledge articles, this is a way how we can start to like really transform the entire act of how we create and manage knowledge. And that then, starts to lead us to, okay, what types of knowledge are we creating and how are we creating it? So do we need to necessarily think about, these giant long policy documents anymore? Or maybe we need to take a more like componentized modular type of setup to how we are designing our contracts, our RFIs, or things like that. And those types of things I think are very interesting, because then that leads you to an entire, rejiggering of your like process in your organization, and that leads to different ways of actually working together. So I know that kind of jumped off pretty far from, what is the areas that are primed to be reinvented by this, but I think it's really, once we move from having kind of these initial point solutions, whether it's in sales or whatever type of lifecycle software development, to having a more holistic set of capabilities, then we can really start to see how this is not just freeing up a bottleneck here, but really enabling us to change the flow of the whole business cycle, whatever that may happen to be. And that's going to happen in the next couple of years, and that's what I think is going to be the really exciting stuff.
Absolutely. True transformation, really, across all.
Yes. And I just wanted to throw that. Now, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think the transformation aspect of generative AI is something that is starting to trip up a lot of people in their initial implementations and rollouts, because we all had kind of, these grand expectations after we used ChatGPT that it would be able to answer all of our questions and, it can design business plans for us and it's all going to be great. But what we are actually seeing from the impact of generative AI in this generation one of applications, as we're seeing these initial rollouts, is that they are incremental changes when you kind of draw them at a high level. Like, they're not yet fully transformational, and that I think is very logical and makes total sense. Like, we don't know what the new shape of collaboration and communication looks like because we haven't actually had the tools to build that system yet. So I think there's been some folks who are kind of like getting cart before the horse in terms of the transformation potential, but then there's also some folks who are saying, oh, well, you're kind of blowing this all out of proportion. This is not actually that interesting. And I don't think those folks are correct either. I think we are in this phase of, as I said earlier, really optimizing how we are implementing these tools. And so we need to manage expectations and build our metrics around how effective this stuff is being with that kind of expectation in mind.
That makes complete sense. People are testing, but the true transformation process changes, people changes, all of that, I think, is what you're saying is yet to come.
Yes.
Absolutely. All right, we're getting down on time, so I'll ask just one or two more questions here. So I think enterprises are sort of they're struggling with silos across the organization. So the question here is around who is best poised in an organization to help avoid additional tech silos that new tech tends to cause.
Yes, let's not do shadow IT all over again, please. So what I'm seeing in organizations, so I'll start with the bad of what I'm seeing. So I'm seeing some organizations basically push forward generative AI initiatives from some kind of GenAI like strategy or tiger team that is not necessarily tied into the broader enterprise strategy or even tied into the IT team. So I think this tying together of a generative AI strategy with your broader enterprise AI analytics business strategy is really key at the beginning here. And so the folks that I've been seeing that are successful with this are basically having the strategy be coordinated and managed by a combination of relatively senior folks. Oftentimes, it'll start in kind of like the marketing or digital organization or something like that, but then very quickly move not into the IT organization, but having a very strong participant and even leadership role from the CIO or in a lot of organizations from the chief of software development and chief data scientist. And having those folks participating in this conversation can really help to accelerate your adoption and kind of the understanding of these use cases. Sorry, I lost the train of thought there. We might want to re-ask that question. I apologize.
No, it's great. So question here is, app first thinking creates silos.
Oh, yes.
Best ways in an organization to help.
Yes, so the app first thinking, like, we obviously don't want to do shadow IT all over again. But what we're seeing in organizations is they can avoid this if they are actually taking a deliberate strategic approach to generative AI. And by this, I don't mean just having, we have a generative AI tiger team or some kind of like group that's like, oh, we're going to throw out all these use cases and not be tied into the broader organization. What I'm talking about is actually having a deliberate strategy where you are integrating the excitement about generative AI with whatever previous AI initiatives you may have had, or even with whatever previous analytics initiatives you may have had, and bringing those different parts of the organization together. Because, as we saw earlier in the slides, you're not just going to be bringing in an application. You're probably not just going to be training a model, not just going to have a BYOAI policy. You're going to be doing all of these things together. And so having a group that is responsible for triaging use cases, for approving, disapproving, new potential applications, that is really important for avoiding this very siloed approach. Additionally, I think it's important for organizations to catalog and understand their vendor providers and what their vendor providers are offering. Because even if you're not kind of sourcing some new capability from some new partner, some new tech provider, somebody at your organization may have found a way to, gain access to some, beta generative AI capability, or even a vendor may have introduced it as part of kind of their baseline capability. And then all of a sudden, some marketing or research part of the organization has access to these tools that you never knew about because they were not an explicit paid part of the engagement, and now you have to think about managing them. So really kind of having a broader strategy that encompasses generative AI overall, application development, and analytics and data science, I think is what is going to ensure success in the short and medium term. And definitely, I'm just going to reemphasize this, not separating your data science and analytics process from your generative AI, broader AI practice. And I mean, that especially, I think, even more so, or not even more so, but I think especially goes when we're just talking about like search specifically and not just generative AI enhanced search. Because one of the big things that we kind of saw over 2023 was folks recognizing, hey, search is a key part of our insights and knowledge strategy. Maybe we should think about folding it into how we're delivering insights overall. This is something we've all been talking about for a number of years, kind of coming down the road. And I think finally people have started to get it at a very grassroots level.
Absolutely. One final question for you. I think it's an important one to ask, especially because we talk technology so much. We are tech first now more than we have ever been before. So the question really is around, what are you seeing companies do right, or how are they upskilling their teams to be able to really manage and thrive in this new space?
So there's no one thing. I would say that it's like a lot of soft things, and it ultimately adds up to having a very tech-hungry culture, I would say. And so what we're seeing in terms of like actual manifestations of this at companies is folks doing things like having demo days of various generative AI tools, having user groups internally to communicate and discuss the use of, for example, a lot of companies are putting their own large language model or a vendor provided one behind a firewall with no additional tooling to kind of give people something to use. Having user groups around that type of thing so folks can start to develop, various techniques for prompting and getting responses and all that type of stuff. But that can help people kind of get up to speed on, or stay up to speed on this. And then additionally, just having kind of ongoing communication and research, both with your kind of digital innovation teams, but then also communicating that out to the rest of the organization. And then the last thing is, I think, to just be very receptive and open and encouraging to any ideas around AI and generative AI that are coming from your broader organization. Now, that doesn't mean that you should listen to all of them and implement them, because a lot of them are going to be bad ideas, or somebody's going to come to you with a generative AI idea that is actually a predictive AI idea. But kind of changing the mindset from, no, we can't do this, or hold off, to yes, but, or yes, and as the response, I think, can really help folks be in a good position for, we've already been in a phase of continuous adaptation, for the past, whatever, like my entire career at this point in time. But that is just going to accelerate even more so as we continue to move forward. So it's really just like recognizing that we are in a continuous state of change, and your organization needs to be set up to address that, not to just say, okay, well, every 5 years, we're going to look at what the new innovations are. It needs to be a cultural practice rather than just kind of a post hoc thought.
Love it. All great things. It makes sense. Dive in, let people get their hands dirty. We're at time. Rowan, thank you so much. For those of you that submitted your questions, we really appreciate them. If we didn't get to your question, a member from our team will respond to you directly. We hope you've enjoyed today's session, hearing from subject matter experts like Rowan. Thank you so much for your time, Rowan. So much to unpack and so many great insights. We hope you have a great day. Rowan, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.